Most beginners rush to make sigils, which misses the one thing that I think actually makes them work in the first place. Because it's not about making a little squiggle on some paper. It's about turning a mundane action into a magical ceremony. So in this video, I will show you how understanding the true origins of sigil magic in the deep past makes your spells safer and easier and more effective. Welcome to Module 2 of the Ultimate Sigil Magic course, delivered completely for free here on my YouTube channel. In this video, you will learn the origins of magic in what we call symbolic thinking, how to use symbolic thinking to make your own spells work better, and how to claim and step into the fascinating 100,000-year-old story of sigil magic that begins all the way back in those first cave paintings and comes all the way right up to you here in the contemporary world. Beginning at the beginning, inevitably, with the very first act of magic. Do you know, I once asked a grimoire spirit what was the very first act of magic? And do you know what it showed me? It showed me a grassy plain and a woman looking at a tree. She was observing how the wind moved through the branches. And then she began to move her own body to match the movements of the tree. Now, did that happen? History is a materialist spell. Bayo Akomolafe, a thinker that's very important to me, says that history requires an occlusion of excess, which makes it not up to the task, essentially, of carrying very big ideas. Facts require small containers. That is a hyperdimensionally true image, the woman with the tree. It's a version of the same image of the arrival of magic that we find all around the world. Consider the origin story of European witchcraft according to Peter Gray. The arrival amongst the daughters of men of fallen angels, the watchers falling to teach mankind. Another example, of course, is the Prometheus story, the stealing of fire from heaven to give to humanity. Wherever you find this motif around the world, what you find is humans behaving like spirits. There is a thing that we do that is different to the rest of the cosmos. Now, in this video, I'm actually going to stick more or less to materialist history, to official history, because as one of the originators of the Stargate program, Dr. Russell Targ, says, one impossible thing at a time. So you can learn sigil magic in this course, and we can do dimensional magic and Atlantis and what have you amongst the membership. One impossible thing at a time. So the story of sigil magic, which is like the fall of the Watchers, and is like the woman in the tree, and is like Prometheus and the fire, from this perspective. And so what I'm going to do now is jump across to some slides and take you through that story, and also what it looks like from a magical perspective, and how magicians can operationalize it towards our own success.
Sigils, a deep history, beginning with a picture of your mother. Why? She knows why. All right, let's begin at what is currently, to my estimation, our earliest beginning. And this is probably the world's oldest form of art, which makes it the world's oldest form of symbolic thinking. It's 500,000 years old and likely made by Homo erectus. Now, I'm just going to leave, for the purposes of this presentation, the vexed issue of human evolution to the side, because what we have is a 500,000-year-old engraved mollusk shell. Who did it? We're not really tracking that with this presentation. This is deep history of sigils, but we're looking for magic. We're looking for symbolic thinking. But so you can, and I will, make the case that sigils are 500,000 years old so far because of this show. Jumping 400,000 years and change, we have Neanderthal cave art Neanderthal were burying their dead and creating magic circles in caves before this. We've got that about 100,000 years ago. But this is a sigil course, so we're looking for the antecedent, the ancestors to that very idea of like inscribing onto things other things. Around the world, we find carved bone and scratched quartzite and so on at about 100,000 years ago. Now, there's something that Peter Gray speaks about and writes about. We had a really good chat about this just before I left London. This notion of the lie. And I write about it in most detail, I think, in Pieces of 8. Now, here's an interesting definition of a lie. It is when a thing is not really a thing. So remember in the beginning where I said magic is when humans behave like spirits. Do other animals express symbolic thinking? Well, this is determined by your worldview because to some extent, the lie, the thing that marks humans out in most traditional cultures, called different things, but you know what I mean. When a thing is not really a thing. Well, so from a materialist perspective, you can say maybe other primates or corvids or dolphins or elephants, anything that appears capable of stealing your sunglasses or painting. You can buy those insane, depressed elephant paintings. So, sure, from a materialist perspective, maybe there's symbolic thinking in a few other species. For the animist, who knows that peccaries and jaguars and so on live in villages, just not when we can see them, the answer is different because the frame is different. One of the things about looking at the deep history of sigils is you have to inevitably consider, well, what is mind? What is reality? Because if symbolic thinking is a function of mind, I need to know about mind, and this is where we are. So for me, the most transformative frame for thinking with mind is found in the Amazon. And I remember the first time I went, whatever that was, 2019. You think about going on dieta in the middle of the Amazon as getting away from it all. But you're in one of the most biodiverse, I think second most biodiverse place on the planet. I think it's like the Great Barrier Reef or something is more biodiverse. Doesn't matter. It's a crowded place. Crowded like a New York subway before the last few years of violence and stabbing. So if you were looking for cosmovisions that can solve for complexity, you want to look here. And in particular, the use of metaphor. So symbolic thinking, a thing is representing another thing. I stick with metaphor for a bunch of reasons, mostly because it's more robust and thought through in indigenous cosmologies like in Australia and the Amazon. We think of metaphors as something fake because the symbol is not really the thing. Like we say purely ceremonial, have you noticed that? To mean powerless. Wait a minute, what are you doing here watching this video if you're using words purely ceremonial? Like, you're a ceremonialist if you do magic, at least correctly. So in the Amazon, metaphor is how crossings happen between here and the spirit world. So when you were dreaming, the events that happen to you in dream are experienced literally. They literally happened in the dream world, but must be interpreted symbolically in the waking world because you've crossed that dimensional divide. In the waking world, everything that happens here, we interpret literally. In the dream world, literally. But if you cross that, you have what I call a metaphoric divide. You have to interpret it, let's say, symbolically or metaphorically. And there's an excellent book, man, like 20 years old now, maybe more. Dr. Eduardo Cohen wrote a book called How Forests Think. And he describes the 3 ways that forests communicate. And this is like old-timey communication theory. Very interesting, very useful. When he was living amongst the Vilaruna in the Amazon. So you have iconic, indexical, and symbolic
forms of conversation. So iconic is mimicry or resemblance. So a bird call that sounds like a predator to scare off other predators. Orchids that look like female bees to attract male bees. Like, it's the language of sameness. And a lot of the forest speaks iconically. Now, indexically, also a lot of the forest speaks indexically. It's to point at something, but it's not the thing that it's pointing to. So a monkey will make a specific call when a jaguar is nearby. So that communication is indexical. It is indexing. It is pointing at the existence nearby of a jaguar. They are pointing to its presence with communication. Now, that is probably around the planet 99% of communication, at least in bodies. And then there's symbolic. So one of the things, I will butcher the exact quotation, but one of the things that Dr. Cohen mentioned is that we need to provincialize human communication, which is to say, we communicate in a way that is extremely like we're the odd ones out. If you think about it in an Amazonian context, the whole forest is communicating with itself, iconically and indexically. And us, humans and spirits, communicate symbolically. Humans and spirits. So Avalaruna hunters have agreements with spirits, and meaning arises through shared understanding and agreement. Think about this. So we're talking about spirit contracts because the spirits have to know when you are offering food to them and what that does and that it is for them. Think about that in your own magical practice. So how do the spirits know that the food that is like your lunch is for them or isn't? Because we have a shared collection of symbols, of patterns that we have agreed to, which is, well, if I put it on this table or if I put it here at this time, it's transdimensional. It's an understanding that arises between essentially two species, right? And that's symbolic communication. Now, one of the serpent beings in the Andes, Amaro, Hakun Amaro, is also the being of the cycling of energy, or is really the cycling of energy, which is, there's an earlier term for the dreaming called the turnaround. Very similar idea, right? So dreams brought back are interpreted symbolically amongst the waking. Ceremony, this is key, and this is key not just for sigil magic, but all magic. Ceremony sent back must also be metaphoric. And there's a Yaminala word, sayoshto, language twisting. Because direct words crash into the spirits. And I'm kind of reminded of one of the Inklings, Owen Barfield. And he was translating Cicero one day, and it was a line about Cato dying in Latin. So he's translating out of Latin into English at Cambridge. And the line translated is that Cato passed out of life, not Cato died. And Barfield sat with this because passed out of life is more accurate. Like, it's more accurate to the feel of what happens. We have this notion that our language is improving as it gets whatever more precise is. But that's not true. Like, we basically lose all the life in it, which means it's less accurate at containing reality. And there's something about this idea of direct words crashing into spirits that feels the same as that for me. So think about this in the context of sigil magic, turning an original statement, non-metaphoric, into something symbolic, a squiggle, that can cross the divide, right? And it's been my experience that something like this underpins all magical metaphysics globally. If you've ever asked, and it's a silly question, but you know what I mean? Like, if you've ever asked, why is ceremony this way? Why? I mean, let's take a Dogra example, or like a West African example. Like, why, when you want to communicate with your ancestors, do you drape yourself in like a feather headdress and do a specific dance? And it's something like this.
it's something like, well, because we have to get that across the metaphoric divide, which means it can't be direct because it will crash it to the. It's that same. When you have it explained to you like this, you feel it. And most importantly, this is why we're doing this as the presentation. It's the justification for it. Because the sigil version of that is like, why can't I write the words new Joe and have a whack? Why this intervening squiggle process? It's something like this. Speaking of Indigenous Australia, this is from Tyson Yunkaporta, who wrote Sandtalk, although I think this is from his second book. Symbol is not a picture, but an engine. So Aboriginal symbols compress enormous relational data, so lore and ethics and rules of ecology and kinship structures and so on, into a form that can be carried or expressed. They are, and this is a quotation, they are living algorithms that perform relationship making, decision making, and memory storage. So if you think about a landscape with cave paintings and songs associated with certain trees and so on, this is what he's talking about here. Like, a symbol is a way of containing more information, almost like hyperdimensionally, than if you'd just written it down. So this is a native Australian description of native Australian imaginal artifacts, of course. So it doesn't directly transfer to your job-seeking squiggle, But I think that everything down here, right, in physical reality, I think that everything down here operates according to the same laws. As Terence McKenna would say, it's my favorite Terence McKenna line, if it's real, it can take the pressure. And so there are, and we have, you can look sideways at them in some of the correct laws of hermeticism. It's like, if you're here in bodies under these conditions, then something like this is going to be in play everywhere. But I have that point to be like, I hope I don't need to say that you're not doing like Aboriginal magic by doing sigils. Here we do comparison to understand and haunt, lovingly haunt what can be dismissed as a simple or prosaic practice otherwise. So this is what I mean. Like, I'm for visualize, as long as you don't concretize into specific axial, you can sense an underlying Paleolithic cosmovision at a time depth sufficient to have informed Aboriginal Australia, Amazonian civilizations, and so on. And it's like the stuff here communicates with the beings there and vice versa. And there are one or two protocols or laws of reality, in the same way that the waveform nature of reality allows radio to work, that we operate with, that we operate under. And certainly, if you've read Starships, I think they were really good at it. I think they were much, much better at it than we are. But you don't need to become a Paleolithic stone levitating master to do sigil magic. You just need to know that a practice like this is, if you see history correctly, is downstream from it. So those Paleolithic stone wizards are ancestors of practice when it comes to this kind of work. And speaking of ancestors of practice, this is in Starships, this is in my first Scarlet Imprint book. One of the important reframes for quote unquote Western magic, I think, because we get our magic from Egypt. We get our magic from Alexandria and Hellenistic Egypt. And then it's a question of how much of the stuff we got from there is Egyptian versus all the other Eastern Mediterranean things that blended into it. And undoubtedly, absolutely is Jewish and Babylonian and Greek and what have you in that, for sure. There's also a lot of Egyptian. So if you get to the very end of Egyptian civilization in the Alexandrian, Ptolemaic, Alexandrian, Hellenistic era, in order to have stuff show up there so that it looks like the same planetary correspondences, the same hubs and so on that we find there, we use today. All right, cool. Alexandria. Alexandria is the final inheritor of this, at that time, I guess, 4,000-year-old civilization, which is dynastic Egypt. All right. So let's go to the beginning of dynastic Egypt. So the other end of the journey that finishes in Alexandria, where we pick up magic. We have the Old Kingdom. We have and whenever this, whenever the actual dates for the initial building of these structures in the Giza complex are, they're certainly older than the 3,500 and change at BC that we have. But if you think of the Old Kingdom, not as the beginning of the Egyptian project, but as the end of the 20,000-year Paleolithic experiments in stone and Neolithic experiments in stone. But hang on. That's your through line. So your modern magic formulated itself, Hellenistic astrology and so on, in those first few centuries AD, in, broadly speaking, let's just say Alexandria, just because it was like the New York of the Eastern Med, right? Okay. And the most significant tributary into Alexandria was literally the Nile. Okay. So where did dynastic Egypt get all that wisdom from? From some of the stuff we're talking about here, from that deep time depth. Again, leaving aside things like Atlantis and other timelines and so on, where we're sticking within official reality for this one. Because if I can make the case here, I can make it anywhere. That's very interesting. So, especially when you consider hieroglyphs being a perfect example of Tyson Yunkaporta's supra-rational. If you look at the symbolist interpretation of Egyptian civilization via Charlotte Lewich, and I will have linked up my podcast episodes with the producers of Magical Egypt, so you get a little bit more context around Charlotte Lewich. He invented the symbolist interpretation of Egypt, and that is that the temples, hieroglyphs, gods are all mystical initiatory devices, which means that they are hyperdimensionally much bigger than the little squiggle of a hawk with a line and a dot underneath it. An Egyptian who could read hieroglyphs didn't read that as a phonetic or even as a word. He or she did, mostly he, let's be honest. But it was also hyperdimensionally coming back to that idea of symbols being able to contain all this information. This is what's upstream from you and your little squares. Because again, Hellenistic soup. This was the cultural magical melting pot that formed more or less the entirety of Western magic. And from here we get more or less, because actually the Greek magical papyri weren't from Alexandria, they were upriver in Thebes. Same world. We have words, spells, and glyphs, and so on. And if you think about Hermeticism, as I got this idea from Dr. Aaron Cheek, the miniaturization of temple technology. So, during the dynastic project in Karnak and various temples, the priest would be responsible for bringing the god into the statue. Similar things happen with pharaohs in the afterlife and opening of the mount ceremony, all that kind of stuff. Because the priests would do that. They would have an opening of the mount ceremony for statues so that the god could speak once it indwelled. So it's this bringing of bigness into a statue, into a fixity that we can encounter. Aaron Cheek has a very good point, which is that Hermeticism essentially takes that temple tech and makes it portable, because now you can do that with your gemstones. Now you can take big beings and ideas and enfold them into something small. This is the deep history. This is the real history of sigils. So there are many courses in the membership that deal with all this, by the way. We're just tracking the deep history of sigils specifically, but we've got courses on the Greek magical papyri and so on. So if you're interested, that's where you find them. Right. So after the Hellenistic period, we get, and I think about this as well, like the Bible. European civilization for the last 1800 years has built itself around the idea that there is one correct book and all other things that are true are in relation to that correct book. So there's the Bible, correct. Church fathers, commentaries, and so on. Not as correct, but kind of correct. Stretching all the way out to, I don't know, Dan Brown, like whatever, airport fiction. So we not only have this miniaturization of Egypt tech and Egypt getting it from tens of millennia ago, that happens in the context of other word spells, right? So the inheritance of sacred writing combined with this Egyptian Hellenistic spirit tradition means that by the time you get to the Grimoires, you have secret alphabets and letters and numbers and word games and all of that stuff. This is the true story of what is upstream of sigils. Before you even get to where people usually start the story, as well they should. I mean, he belongs in it, right? The English artist Austin Osman Spare. Now, it's funny, right? Because he wasn't strictly a sigil magician in the modern sense. He did write some very personal things. He created his own system of magic. That's what made him, I think. I mean, he was an unbelievably good artist. Like I've seen when I was living in London, I saw a couple of his shows, and it's incredible stuff. Like he did a Royal Academy of the Arts. I think when he was like 20, he was an unbelievably talented guy. But he also created his own system of magic that blended psychology and artistic creation and philosophy and so on. And all this is contained in his scant magical writings, this notion of the alphabet of desire, which is to devise a lexicon for speaking to where men conjures. That's where he fits into the story of sigils, as I tell them. And it was Spare and Spare's work that was a cornerstone of the inspiration for like Pete Cowell and Wei Shou and so on, the English magical scene in the 80s. And sigils were part of early chaos magic's iconoclastic arsenal. The scene was quite moribund in the 80s. There'd been who cares about the OTO, but there'd been like an OTO lineage collapse and it had to be re-imported from the US. And it's just kind of, I mean, like coming out of the 70s and, you know. So this exciting iconoclasm was a shot in the arm, a real shot in the arm. Now, like Spare, the early versions of like quote unquote how sigils work is based on the theory of mind of the day. And it's moved on, just as it's moved on from Spare's understanding, early 20th century unconscious. Theory of mind has also moved on from late 20th century unconscious. And it was from this point with chaos magic that sigils, of course, spread into wider modern folk magic. And even monoculture, like I think if you lined up, let's say you're in a major city, I think if you lined up 15 people, one of them who don't do magic, like one of them will kind of, oh, sigil magic. Yeah, I think someone will know it. Someone will have learned about it from Grant Morrison's The Invisibles or something they saw on the internet or magazine counterculture or what have you. There'll be someone who'll be like, oh, yeah, I vaguely know what you're talking about, which is quite impressive. Magic squares and things haven't made it into monoculture, but sigils have, sort of. All right. And that brings us to complete the deep history of sigils to today and some of the 21st century developments. And the key ones that I would say are associated with Rune Soup is like shoaling and robofish. Terms you will, if you don't already know, you will learn as we do this course. And also some like more insta-worthy, but ultimately redundant methods of generating. And I say ultimately redundant because I'm not that good at art. And also, if you like that stuff, like make it more ornate. I'm more interested in the outcomes. Most of the time. Sometimes I'm in the mood to get pretty, I guess, to gussy up. But that's sort of where we're at for today. And just as a reminder, before we jump back in for praxis, this is your story to keep. This is, you don't have to do anything. Keeping is doing something. To keep a story is for you to know. You don't need to tell anyone. I hope it changes how you do sigils, in the sense of I hope you sit in the 100,000 year story, 500,000 year story that they are. But knowing this true quote unquote antiquity of the practice, that it is a modern expression of the same sort of stuff we think we can see in 50,000-year-old, well, 25,000-year-old, 18,000-year-old stone circles and the color paleo effect. So it's yours to keep. Anyway, let's do some praxis, shall we?
There we go. Quite the journey, isn't it? And as we finish off this module, I'm going to leave you with some praxis. I want you to gather your current sigil making tools. I want you to gather your pencils and your art paper and your notebook and paint pens and whatever else you have. And I want you to have them in front of you. And you're going to put your hands just gently touching these materia and have your eyes rest gently on them. And what I want you to do is bring to mind this amazing journey, this 100,000-year-old journey, and bring to mind the multiple times a day you make that dimensional jump between the dream world and the waking world. You do it at least once when you wake up in the morning. Maybe you waking up at 3 a.m. to go to the bathroom as well. But I want you to think about the exchange and the turnaround from this world to the next, across that metaphoric divide. How messages and insight and blessings from the spirit world cross the metaphoric barrier to us here, and how we send things across. And as you look at your material, think of the process of making sigils. It's a sentence. And then the sentence starts to transform. And it starts to become a thing that is recognized by the spirit world. It starts to metaphorize. It starts to become something that can move through that dimensional divide. This is a deep insight, gifted by the Watchers, gifted by Prometheus. This is magic, knowing this and knowing that it's yours and it's an heirloom.